Good morning, everybody, and good afternoon to those of you who may be watching from other parts of the world, or good evening, dear friends, colleagues, and distinguished guests. On behalf of the International Peace Institute, I'd like to welcome you to today's event on women's agency in post-conflict reconciliation in Colombia, Uganda, and Sri Lanka. This event is being held as part of CSW 67, which focuses on innovation and technological change and education in the digital age for achieving gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls. Last week at IPI, we held an event on using innovation and technology to advance gender equality. And today we will focus on innovation in a different sense, with a view towards the innovative ways that women are building peace in their communities. The link between protection and participation of women peace builders has been a key focus of IPI's research over the past few years. So we are eager to hear more from our panelists across these contexts. Today's event, which is being held in partnership with the Gender, Justice, and Security Hub, will share findings on women's roles in post-conflict reconciliation in Colombia, Sri Lanka, and Uganda, to understand how women's roles in these settings have helped to contribute to more sustainable peace. It is our hope that the conversation today will not only facilitate a sharing of experiences across contexts, but will also contribute to advancing the full participation of women and girls as peace builders. IPI is very grateful for our partnership with the Gender, Justice, and Security Hub, and to all of our distinguished panelists representing perspectives from academia, local peace building networks, and the policy community. Once again, thank you for joining us today. And I realize I have forgotten to introduce myself. So let me belatedly say that my name is Jenna Russo, and I am the Director of Research here at IPI. And we're so happy to have you here today. I'd like to now invite Kirsten Ainley, who is the co-principal investigator of the Gender, Justice, and Security Hub and an associate professor of international relations at Australia National University, to come and provide opening remarks. Kirsten?
Good morning, everybody. I will be brief, but I wanted first to say thank you very much to IPI for co-hosting this event today. It's really a pleasure to be here, and thank you all for attending. I'm going to say something briefly about the wider research hub that the research here is a part of. The Gender, Justice, and Security Hub is a research and advocacy network working with local and global civil society, practitioners, governments, and international organizations to advance gender justice and inclusive peace. It's a 5-year project fully funded by the UK's Research and Innovations Global Challenges Research Fund, and I co-convene it with Professor Christine Chinkin, who many of you may know, and who has had a very long and distinguished career working for women's rights in CSW and other arenas. So what does the hub do? Well, it tries to create new knowledge, research methods, and advocacy networks to amplify the voices of women and marginalized groups, to help motivate reforms that affect local and global policy change. We're looking to advance the delivery of SDG 5 on gender equality and 16 on peace, justice, and strong institutions, and also the implementation of the Women, Peace, and Security agenda. The Hub's research, and I'd encourage you to go to the Hub's website at thegenderhub.com to see more about the detail of the many research projects. The Hub has over 30 research projects and looks at 7 focus countries in particular, although a broader number of countries throughout the projects. But in terms of where our focus lies, it's on Afghanistan, Colombia, Kurdistan, Iraq, Lebanon, Sierra Leone, Sri Lanka, and Uganda. The projects in the Hub vary in their focus, from migration to empowerment, from land rights to health, from masculinities to money. But today we have 3 of our most senior researchers to talk about their work on a topic of critical contemporary relevance on women's agency in post-conflict reconciliation. So I'll hand over to Phoebe for the panel, and thank you again for your attendance and for the hosting.
Thank you, Kirsten, and thank you to our partners at the Gender, Justice, and Security Hub. My name's Phoebe Donnelly, and I'm the head of our Women, Peace, and Security program here at IPI, and I will be moderating the panelists. So I'll start by introducing the panelists briefly, posing them a question to kick off their introductory remarks, and then after each of the panelists have given their opening remarks, we'll have a Q&A section. So please think of your comments now. We'll call from the floor as well as our online audience. So I'm going to start with Angelica Retberg. She is a professor in the Political Science Department at Universidad de los Andes and a co-director of the Gender, Justice, and Security Hub at UK Research and Innovation's Global Challenges Research Fund. And that I'm just going to read one line of everyone's bio. We have a very distinguished panel, so do please feel free to look at their full bios. Angelica, in what ways does conflict affect women's political participation? Are there lessons learned surrounding women's increased political agency in the post-conflict reconciliation process?
Thank you, Phoebe. Good morning, everyone. And
Just hit the button.
Yeah, there we go. Thank you so much for coming here this morning. I'm very pleased to be at this meeting at IPI, and thanks also for the Gender Hub for having supported our research for so many years and through many difficult times. So I'd like to maybe start by saying that I think of politics writ large. It's not just about elections, it's also about participating in political life overall in a society. Colombia's population is made up mostly of women who can vote since 1954. There are gender quotas in place. 30% of Congress needs to be in Senate and House should be women. The special peace jurisdiction that was put in place back in 2017 is 50% women. So in terms of in numerical terms, I think there's many reasons for hope in the sense that gender parity gender equality is starting to be is broadened and strengthened in the country. At the same time, the conflict has had severe impacts on women's participation in politics. First of all, as you may all know, more than 9 million people have been registered as victims of the armed conflicts in Colombia. Most of them, especially most of the victims of forced displacement are women. And this means that overall there has been a very hostile environment for women's participation in politics. I insist not only elections, but general participation in leadership positions, in developing civil society agendas. And I think this is worth noting as a long-time legacy of conflict. Women have suffered in many ways, specifically in just, formally taking part in political life. At the same time, I should stress that women have not only been victims, they have developed significant agency in the country, and I think that is an important part of this bittersweet, I guess, story of women in politics in Colombia. It shows that there are delays and backlashes, but there's also been lots of opportunity for strengthening women's participation in politics. And what I mean by this is that, for instance, in the study that we've conducted, looking at peace initiatives led by civil society in Colombia, women have played a very important role in leading many of these civil society peace initiatives. And at the same time, many of the issues these initiatives have dealt with have had to do with gender and women's issues as well. So it's not only women's participation in person, but also the topics that have been the focus of these civil society peace initiatives. This, I think, is important because in contrast with other countries where conflict just wreaks havoc and finishes up most of civil society, Colombia has been a case where both in response to conflict intensity as well as in response to institutional opportunities, there have been many possibilities for civil society to participate and women among them. In the peace agreement that was signed in 2016, specifically, special emphasis was placed on gender issues, on women's issues. A subcommission of gender was formed. Women took part in the negotiating teams, albeit only after pressure was exerted, not from the beginning. At the beginning, it was pretty much a man's negotiation. And with time, women were added to the teams and gender issues were added to the discussion. At the same time, and this shows, the opportunities for success as well as for significant ongoing problems. This peace agreement that was signed in 2016 was submitted to a referendum that same year in October, and the no won. And many blamed this on so-called gender ideology. So there was a significant backlash on gender issues after the first agreement had been signed. The adjusted agreement pretty much weeded out much of the gender references. And not only that happened, also there was an implosion of the women's movement after the final signature of the agreement. Many blamed the gender movement or the feminist movement or the women's movements, more generally speaking, for the demise of the referendum. And this, I think, was again, I guess, some lessons learned from that. It shows the limits of inclusion, and it shows also the political and strategic use of arguments against gender in implementing some of these peace agreements. I'd love to go into more detail if you like later, but right now I will just say that despite this backlash, there have been more opportunities for progress in time. Abortion was legalized last year. A sexual violence case was opened up by the special peace jurisdiction in the transitional justice system of Colombia last year, illustrating that gender issues and women's issues are still very much on the public peace agenda, with strong participation by women. Just to finalize, because I think I'm running out of time, I would just like to say that conflict, of course, has had multiple impacts on women's participation, as I said, not only in terms of elections, but also overall in terms of the legacies of conflict on the possibilities for women to take part in public debate, for their issues to be heard and discussed and debated in public debate. One thing that I'd like to stress, which is important, I think, for the Colombian case, is much of this debate happens among and within institutions. So in that sense, I think this helps us illustrate this idea that, conflict doesn't necessarily mean there's an absence of institutions. Colombia, in fact, has seen a significant consolidation of institutions across time, and it's those institutions that are currently debating many of these issues related to gender. As I already mentioned, both the Constitutional Court as well as the Special Peace Jurisdiction have made a point of protecting and promoting women's issues. There are, of course, also debates within civil society, as well as within the women's movement, as I've mentioned. Women, I should also add from my very own research, tend to be much more skeptical about reconciliation, except when they're empowered. And I think this is a very important political point, which shows that that many of these issues of power that are involved in addressing gender issues, once they are able to lead to women's empowerment, may actually go to the benefit of peace consolidation. What I would just like to end with is that in a way, war catalyzed grassroots mobilization and women's mobilization, more generally speaking, in response to many of the costs faced by these movements due to conflict. But at the same time, I think it helped us build, in a way, more gender sensitive institutions, and also develop the legal framework that we hope to be benefiting from in the coming future. So in a way, conflict for a time just basically just oversaw it all. Conflict really shaped all our opinions on pretty much anything. And now that the veil of conflict has been lifted, I'm not saying violence is over, but the formal armed conflict has certainly produced some results. I think that society is now focusing on many of the other gender issues that conflict just didn't let us make visible. So I would just like to end by that. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Angelica. I will now turn to Visakha Dharmadasa. She is the founder of the Association of War-Affected Women in Sri Lanka and a project partner on the Gender Justice and Security Hub. And I'd like to start with the question, in each context we're discussing today, women are disproportionately represented among the victims of armed conflict. How can reconciliation processes give women more agency to respond to the harms they have suffered? Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good morning to all of you. And thank you to IPI as well, the Hub, for giving this opportunity. I'm a peace builder and a peace activist from the ground. So it's really nice to also sit with Angelica here from Colombia, because we do have a lot in common. One thing is the gender subcommittee, where the Sri Lankan women could really institutionalize within the peace process. It was at the beginning. I mean, when they started, the women called, and thanks to Norwegians, we could have the gender subcommittee. Of course, the peace process is failed, but we could have it. So start with a positive note. There's a lot. And I just wanted to tell a little about the Sri Lankan conflict. More than 100,000 people have died in a 27-year-old brutal war. I mean, let's call it what it is. And the damage to the property is not even counted even up to date. And so 1/3 of the fighters of the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam were women. So so you see also the difference about women getting up there, but they get up there and then later part, how much we can really, not for fighting, but to build peace, how much we can keep that agency within. I mean, that's a question that we'll have to ask from all of us. 25% households are women-headed in my country. So it's really, and also we do have more than 65,000 widows from the conflict. So these are huge numbers in a small country with a very relatively small population. I want to tell you that we as women, even during the war, the women's groups could come together. I mean, that's how our organization was established, for the women to come together across the divide to call for a stop. I mean, what we said was stop so that let our children live. It was just, that was our demand, coming together across all the divides. And I think that was really powerful. Because of that, also when the peace negotiation started, we went to the Norwegians as civil society, as mothers and wives as well, women from the society, with 75,000 signatures. We went to the Norwegian embassy. I can remember it was a Saturday that the ambassador kept the doors open for us to come there. And we were the first to demand for Norway to facilitate, even before the government of Sri Lanka officially called them. And I also must say, 7 women. I'm a mother of a missing soldier. My 2 sons are in the Sri Lankan military. So my second son was reported missing in action. And 7 of us, only women, went to meet the Liberation Tigers, with all difficulties. Several hours, like 5 to 6 hours at each checkpoint. Getting in, also, very scared, because you see the youngsters in plain clothes, but 356 in their back, in bicycles, surrounding our vehicle. But I'm really happy these women and their families kept the trust on me to bring them back. And we could broker the ceasefire. Now, this is one thing, because we didn't document, nor we thought, we should take the credit for that. It's the latter part that we understood, my goodness, we have broken a ceasefire. Because we could go as mothers and ask from the eyes of the tigers. What I said was that we came to see your teeth and claws, tigers. They started laughing, and that made a connection as mothers and sons. So that is something which I also have heard from Ambassador Swanihunt, that in South America, that one lady went on a horse to meet the rebels. And I know from Pakistan, our friend Mozrat have gone and met the Taliban. So, I mean, women do these things. They maybe not even document. It's the necessity that drive us to be there. And from the research teams, what we want is to document our work, because then we can have a good case to advocate and lobby to have the women there. Answering to your question, women do have the agency. The agency is there. It's just quoting Lord Ahmed, women do have a voice. The world should listen to them, right? So a few suggestions that it is a must to get the women in voices in the DDR process. Much before anything. Disarmament, we know Lema could manage it there, right? So disarmament, demobilization, and integration, and we also say, have another R, rebuilding. And we want the UN to get that R on board, because we do need to rebuild our lives. And also, to have them from day one in the reconciliation process, and also parallelly to DDR, we have to start the TJ process, a gender-sensitive transitional justice process to be in place. International Civil Society Action Network have done marvelous animations on these. 2-3 minutes, you could really get it. How the women come together, and then how we rebuild our lives. So that is important. So I'll stop at that and we'll be very happy to answer questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And thank you both to the concrete examples you've provided to really help illustrate these cases, and also for the similarities we can start to see across context. It's really exciting that we have 3 different contexts represented here. I'll now turn to Josephine Ahikiri. She's Associate Professor of Gender Studies at the School of Women and Gender Studies and a principal of the College of Humanities and Social Sciences at Makerere University. And she's a co-director of the Gender Justice and Security Hub. Josephine, to what extent do you think social aspects of post-conflict recovery are given the same weight as economic recovery policies and reconciliation processes?
Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and greetings from Uganda. I had prepared a presentation on my computer, and it has refused to open, so that's good for you, I think, as a moderator. I would like to actually start from where Visaka left, the reconstitution of lives, much before anything else. I'll talk from the context of Uganda, where the northern part of the country was ravaged by war over 15 years ago. The big guns have gone silent. There was a war where there were rebels called the Lord Resistance Army fighting government, and both forces had wreaked havoc on the population, but much more importantly, population were displaced, huge movements of people living in internally displaced camps, and abduction of people into rebel camps, especially children. And that context then means that people were removed from their livelihood, from their social networks and all that. And what happens now, for us as the Gender Justice Hub, we want to bring those local experiences to talk to global debates around peace building. What are the deficiencies of peace building, especially when we look at the case of the northern part of Uganda? So we started off this research looking at land and livelihood, and we said that while the big guns went silent around 2008, the small guns are up around land, sexual violence, domestic violence, mental health deficiencies, and particularly bringing about a new phenomenon of floating population. And somebody would ask, how are these related to the gender aspect? One of the things I would like to focus on for today, given the limitation of time, is the phenomenon of floating populations as a new emerging phenomenon. How does it come about? We have the children who were abducted, and some of the girls became wives of commanders and so on. And also children who went to in internally displaced camps, some of them were raped and they bore children as girls. That meant that their fatherhood, the fatherhood of their children was in contestation. And when they bear these children, on return, the children cannot actually make a claim on family land. And of course, that is also a sort of emerging social construction, because according to the culture, in a sense, if a girl produces a child before marriage and the father is not known, officially, that child should belong to the girl's family. But because of the war and the kind of inherent breakages within even the social networks. Now these children are rejected by the families of the girl, and they constitute what they have called the Latino camp, Agu, and in the local setting, they are called street children, but actually these children belong to the post-war inefficient reconstruction, because there was concentration on physical infrastructure and very little on the rebuilding of social cohesion in the community. And what has happened actually is that the fact that these children are floating, they are building their own subculture, and they've become a threat. It's a new war front. The local universities there attest to the fact that students cannot actually study at night because there's a threat, there's a security threat. And in a sense, the response of the security sector has been to arrest these children, put them in prisons and so on. And what we've been telling them is that this is a social situation. You are going to arrest these children, but you are not arresting the social situation, because the social situation is embedded within the deficiencies of the peace building process that has been on since the guns went silent. And so the issue is that there has to be the reconstruction and the reintegration of the kind of women's voice that should be concretely informing some of the initiatives. We've been arguing, for example, that women or all these girls sustained these communities during the war by providing food and so on. And therefore, there has to be a continuation of that agency to redefine belonging and to redefine what claims should be legitimate in this period. This is specifically important because when you have a huge population that is floating on the basis that their fathers are not known, it's a rearming of a patriarchal definition that had even been addressed by the Constitution in 1995, which argues that both parents can bequeath citizenship to their children, regardless of sex, which means that, you know, if local authorities, for example, are saying these children do not have a known clan, therefore we cannot issue them with national identity cards. And then you are asking, how does a clan actually supersede the clan question, supersede the constitution that gives birthrights to all that are born in the country and so on. So what needs to be done really, getting back to Visaka, is to rebuild, to ensure that there are clear initiatives and to rebuild lives and to re-engage communities in a sense that they are able to address these inherent deficiencies. We've seen a lot of mental issues, children killing their parents, their grandparents, because of their contestations around origin and identity. And so maybe I'll stop there, and if there are questions, I can address them. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Josephine. And we now have two more R's added. We have rebuilding and re-engaging communities. So thank you for drawing those out for us. And you did great. You didn't even need the presentation written. So I will now turn to our last panelist, Pablo Castillo-Diaz. He is a policy specialist at UN Women. And Pablo, I want to ask you, from your perspective at UN Women, what can multilateral institutions like the UN, and specifically UN Women, do in emerging post-conflict spaces to better support women's leadership? Thank you, Pablo.
Thank you, Phoebe. It's a pleasure to be here. So when thinking about reconciliation, the first thing that comes to mind in terms of UN Women programming is our support to Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, which is a bit of one of our, not our bread and butter, it is one of those interventions that have taken root for, have been there for the longest. UN Women may have supported more than 24 of these Truth and Reconciliation Commissions over the past 2 decades. And in many cases, it's seen as one of the perhaps easiest spaces where to insert women's agency in post-conflict leadership. Recently, obviously, everybody holds up the Colombia example as one of the best, but you can also look at the work in Tunisia, where the Truth and Reconciliation Commission had a dedicated budget line to facilitate women's participation. Even in the Central Africa, both these, Colombia and Tunisia, had 45% women commissioners. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission in the Central African Republic also has 45% women commissioners. In Sudan, after the revolution, but before the coup, the transitional justice law had also said that women needed to be almost half of the commissioners in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and had a provision for reparations for sexual violence survivors and things like that. And that takes me to the other intervention that we try to support, and that is perhaps most forward-looking in transitional justice, which is reparations. Which we've always seen that it is one of the most demanded transitional justice interventions by women, but one of the least provided or given. And we have seen some movement in that regard in recent times. I mean, the Colombia example, they've begun to give reparations to a significant number of sexual violence survivors, but also even in places like the DRC, they just adopted a law in December of last year for reparations, including for conflict-related sexual violence survivors. In November, in Mali, they also adopted a law, reparations for sexual violence survivors, including for reparative reconstructive surgery, treatment of STIs, medical support, et cetera, et cetera. Iraq just added a $17 million budget line to support reparations in implementation of the Yazidi female survivors law. And they already have 2,000, 3,000 applicants already since only September. This has only happened in the last few months. I mean, I know that for a couple of decades, we kept asking, about reparations. We really didn't have that many examples to give of actual reparations given to sexual violence survivors. I think Kosovo was one of the places where we worked the longest, and only in 2018, almost 20 years after the war, they started receiving these monthly stipends, sexual violence survivors. But obviously, reconciliation is much broader than transitional justice. And in 2015, the Secretary General asked this question to UN Women, basically, how can we better support women's leadership in national dialogues and reconciliation efforts? So we have that study from 2015. It's interesting to read it now, but the study reviewed different case studies from Afghanistan and from Rwanda. I think it was the constitution-making process in Rwanda from 2000 to 2003. In Afghanistan, it was also the constitution-making process after the first gender apartheid by the Taliban, so and after the Bonn Agreement, so in 2003. And then the National Dialogue Conference in Yemen in 2013, which has been seen for a long time and may still be today the best example of very sophisticated mechanisms to ensure women's participation in a national dialogue. And so when we look at that study, we see lots of recommendations. I would recommend for you to take a look at it. But unsurprisingly, some of the findings are that international pressure manages to include women in national dialogues, when all of the attention is on that process, but that this is often ephemeral. They're never included in the preparations for the national dialogue, and they're almost never included in the implementation of the national dialogue. So these gains often dissipate afterwards. The study talks about the necessity to build a deep bench of women leaders, identify women leaders in different areas of life, go to the villages, see who's managing women's market associations, identify young women that are for the first time being mobilizing politically and participating in protests, all kinds, a very diverse, deep bench of women leaders. Have some of the older women who have been involved in politics for a long time mentor the younger women. Huge importance on long-term funding to women's networks. And the study argues for even, sort of mechanisms to disperse smaller grants over a longer period of time, which was something we had already heard for years, and we were already looking at this and working on what became the Women's Peace and Humanitarian Fund, which was basically a reaction to this. And the study really emphasizes how intensive and comprehensive the support by the international community needs to be. It's not something that, it may be something, it's something that requires intensive coordination by the donors, by the UN, by the different agencies involved, because again, you want it to be multi-year, to be able to help with skills building, with access to resources, with coalition building, with outreach, access to stakeholders, networking, and all of that is not cheap and it's not easy and it takes a long time. And so she observed that this is something that is often done, a little bit haphazardly. And perhaps most importantly, she gave a huge importance to the to quotas. Not surprisingly, the Yemen example was good because of those interlocking quotas, the youth quota, the gender, the women's quota, and actually the fact that they were tied together make it easier for them not to unravel. But also the importance of placing women in visible positions in these national dialogues, chairing committees or, positions in the committees that would break deadlocks or, those sorts of things, as rapporteur, et cetera, et cetera. He had all of these recommendations. If we look now, after all of those years, we often hear from mediators that it is difficult to include women at the peace table because peace negotiations are, these complicated places with a reduced number of people focused on the fighters and the peace spoilers and all of that. But for national dialogues, you really don't have that excuse at all. They're supposed to be broad and inclusive and representative. And what we see is that we're not faring much better in these national dialogues either. We, just a few years ago in Libya, I think they were preparing this national dialogue. Women were 3 out of the 37 people in the committee preparing the national dialogue. They had consultations with 7,000 people. Women were only a quarter of the participants. In Iraq, also 2 or 3 years ago, I remember women, we would keep holding this. I don't know if you heard the executive director the other day saying, we keep having meetings to talk about women's participation rather than mandating women's participation in the actual meetings they should influence. The Iraqi women would have conference after conference with hundreds of Iraqi women speaking about reconciliation and their recommendations and everything. But then in the High National Council on Reconciliation, there were barely any women. Then same thing with in the current crisis, in the current political crisis, women not involved at all in recent months. In the Central African Republic, just last year, there was this big national dialogue, 450 people, only 17% of them are women, only 2 women out of the 10 in the presidium. Examples after examples of this. Secondly, the study from 2015 that I referenced before said, again, this dissipates in the implementation phase. And I think there was a study of 1,500 peace agreements from 2000 to 2016. that said that in only 25 of them, women's role in implementation mechanisms was mentioned. Not 25%, but 25 out of the 1,500 peace agreements. And we see this all the time, in Libya, all of these, these committees that have been formed to follow up on the Berlin conference, very low participation of women. In South Sudan, after the peace agreement, after a few years ago, they have this 35% quota. They haven't met it. Only 2 committees have, stuck around 20%. In the Central African Republic, stuck around 16%. In Mali, they just went from 3% to 38% after years and years of the international community asking for it, the Security Council asking for it. But it's a little bit late in the sense, the peace agreements from 2015, it's been 8 years, 40 meetings of these committees, and now there've been 2 coups. The peace process is that now you have the women included in the committee. So in some sense, we have maybe a little bit more success at the subnational level in working on peace building and reconciliation. Obviously, all of the work of the Peace Building Fund over the last few years and their prioritization of women's empowerment and women's leadership has made a difference. We have good examples on them helping increase, women's participation in land commissions in specific districts in Niger, or you may have heard of the women mediators in Burundi, preventing local conflict, by the thousands, with the women's peace huts, et cetera, et cetera. And this is work that UN Women often supports. It is also interesting to see in the last 2 or 3 years, the Department of Peacekeeping Operations much more involved in this kind of work. And this is important because they have large, large units of what they call civilian affairs, who work with the communities and do outreach and partner with community actors. And they really do have a larger reach throughout the country, and they have the operational heft and the logistics to be able to reach remote areas. UN Women often is limited to the capital, or only maybe a couple of sub offices, but they can't reach further beyond. And so you may see, we've tried to document this in the annual reports of the Secretary General. We see lots of examples where women mediate between rivaling tribes in the DRC or in Libya, and where women play an important role. And this is often not visible, not recognized. We're trying to make it a little bit more visible. We see sometimes, more gender provisions in agreements that are negotiated locally than in the big national ones, where there hasn't been such progress really over the last 10 years. For example, in Central African Republic, I mentioned earlier, only 16% of women 17% in the national dialogue, 16% in the implementation committees. In the local peace and reconciliation committees, it's more like 34, 35% and going up. And so maybe I'll finish with the 2 levers that I think the UN and other multilaterals need to focus on based on this 2015 study. And one obviously is quotas. With all of their flaws and their insufficiencies, it is one of the best tools that we have. There has been a sea change in how the UN is supporting and promoting quotas in the last 10 years. It wasn't always this way, and there's still some, there could still be more support for them. But basically, in the last 10 years, we've gone from, I think, 52 countries that had legislated quotas to 94. Obviously, in CSW 65, we went from the sort of the vague gender balance to 50-50. We had no data on local quotas, and I think now 86 countries have quotas at the local level. I think that it's important that we do the same that we did for politics, that we do for peace and security institutions. And we still don't. We don't count women's participation in these processes. It's all very ad hoc and difficult to find, and it is something that we must do much more on. And secondly, on funding. Obviously, we know about the Peace Building Fund. and the work that they do. There are good examples of gender markers in UN trust funds in post-conflict countries. Colombia, obviously, is one that, again, people mentioned with 30%. Myanmar had also an important earmark. We often also say that it would be important for to have a gender marker in the peace spending of the government and not the UN only, because what the UN is spending is only a fraction of what's being spent in the country. So with all of the good examples from Colombia, for example, I think the Office of the Comptroller said recently, or maybe 2 years ago, that in all of their spending, the spending from the government in the implementation of the peace agreement, only 4% was dedicated to advancing gender equality over the previous 2 years. And that is something that should be tracked in other contexts and would help us as well illuminate some of the gaps. And I'll close maybe with then the Women's Peace and Humanitarian Fund, which is one of the, I would say, better stories of the last few years. It came out precisely in reaction to some of these concerns about women's peace movements and women's organizations at the local level not receiving enough attention and funds. And only in the last, it was created in it started working in 2016, and it's already helped 900 organizations. And this is the talking point that I like the most. I think half of them are receiving UN funds for the first time. And I think that is sort of a criterion that should be used in general in our engagement in conflict and post-conflict countries much more often. Do I have 1 more minute? Just I guess on a pessimistic note, well, it was all pessimistic, but when you invited me to this, I was a little bit shocked by the title, because it seemed to me like like the kinds of events that we would be holding years ago, and we haven't recently, because we used to work much more in post-conflict spaces, and now we have to focus on these sort of raging, active conflicts. And in many cases, the women's organizations and the women activists we work with don't really want anything to do with reconciliation in many of these countries. So we're seeing that in, obviously in Afghanistan or in Sudan, the absolute no to power sharing agreements with the military, in Myanmar, even in Palestine, much more than before. Obviously, in Ukraine, you can't really talk about peace. All the social cohesion work being done is between the IDP populations and their hosts, their fellow Ukrainians who are hosting it. It's not really beyond that. So it has changed the way that we work. And something that the study from 2015 that I started the presentation with said was, all of this can be reversed. All of these gains can be lost. You have to anticipate the backlash. I think Angelica was the one that mentioned the backlash on the women's movement in Colombia. You have to anticipate the backlash from the start, prepare for it, prepare for reprisals against the women activists involved in this. And this also affects the way that we work on women, peace, and security in some of these countries, and often impedes us from working on reconciliation more than as much as we'd like to.
Thank you, Pablo. So I have some questions lined up, but I want to look to our esteemed audience here to see if anyone wants to take the floor. Anne-Marie, go ahead. And if everyone could introduce themselves, we have a floating mic. Anne-Marie, thank you.
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Anne-Marie Gutz from New York University. Thank you to the whole panel. That was really rich, and I appreciated all the viewpoints. I have a question about what each of you would take as good indicators of women's agency in reconciliation or post-conflict reconstruction processes. Because I feel like, the Women, Peace, and Security agenda relies on this assumption that there is this post-conflict moment that women can capitalize on to surge ahead in politics, especially if there's quotas. But in fact, they're doing so in a highly hyper masculinized environment with a lot of very empowered men, empowered from the fighting. And so the difficulties sometimes tend to be underestimated. And so very specifically, I wanted to ask about things like, would the voting gap, the gendered voting gap, be an interesting indicator? Have you got any data on this? Because we're now discovering in places like Mali, for example, that women are not necessarily, they have no ID, they're not necessarily registered to vote, they don't necessarily participate even in the first step of political participation. What about women in local government? Numbers of women in local government, is that a sign? Sri Lanka has astonishingly low numbers of women in local government and national government in spite of high labor force participation. It's very unusual. Uganda is the opposite. Very high levels of women in national government and local government, partly because of reserved seats, of course. So would that be a good indicator? Others that I think would be interesting to look at, and I love your views on, women in the executive, obviously women in the cabinet, particular policies or laws. Can you think of any that actually demonstrate women's agency in reconciliation? Are there any kind of flagship landmark laws or policy changes that are to be aimed at? And then finally, expanded registration of women for birth certificates and voting. Josephine, you mentioned that the floating population thing is so disturbing and so important. That these individuals, these children don't have ID, or they don't have citizenship, but they're not recognized. That actually, as we know, is part of SDG 16. It's one of the targets, expanding ID cards and birth registration. And it apparently is the part of SDG 16, which is the hardest to fund and is slowest in terms of implementation. And it's not looked at as a gendered resource for citizenship and agency. And I'm wondering if that also would be a good indicator of agency. And then just finally, a question specifically for Josephine on the perspective of women leaders and feminist leaders and activists in Uganda. What is their perspective on what's to be done about this floating population? And especially at local levels, because you invoked at the beginning the importance of local solutions, but often it's local prejudices or biases that can leave these problems unaddressed. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And I will throw out one question, turn it back to the panel as well, and then we'll take your question. Pablo, thank you for kind of calling out the event title. I'm happy when a title surprises or provokes a reaction. Before we came to the stage, we were talking a bit about this post-conflict label. And, feminists have long talked about the challenge in labeling post-conflict. And some of our panelists had some opinions about what their context should be called instead. So I wanted to just give an open question if anyone wants to remark on or kind of push back on this post-conflict label and let us know instead how we should be better talking about your context in particular. So we'll go reverse order. So Josephine, why don't you start us off, and then we'll go Visaka and Angelica.
Thank you very much. Yeah, the term post-conflict actually is could we say problematic or contradictory sometimes, because in many of these cases there is real conflict, and maybe we are talking about post-war. For the Uganda case, I didn't talk about post-war generally because the war ended in almost 40 years ago. And if you say Uganda is in post-war, people may think that you are a warmonger. But actually, there are several conflicts, and conflicts around land. People are killing each other, conflicts at the domestic level, on the street, and so on. So post-conflict can be contradictory, but I think that's a term that we may have to work with. And sometimes we talk about post-conflict conflicts, conflicts that are actually direct offshoots of the inherent kinds of deficits within the conflict and the peacemaking process. The role of women leaders. sometimes I think we overrate the extent to which women are able to do something different from the mainstream. First of all, because they are coming in as people who have been distanced from power. In a way, they are peripheral to effective power. And then sometimes we expect them to actually be the ones to be the change makers or the deal to change the rules of the game. And that is, I think, where the peace processes, participation, and so on has a weakness, because there is an assumption that when you bring women in, they'll automatically, kind of bring all these things and increase women's agency and all that, forgetting that the institutional rules actually have not changed, and there is a need to galvanize that transformative kind of to change the power and the ways in which power operates in many of these contexts. So in a sense, in the Ugandan case, you'll find that you have a female minister, male minister, same results, because they are operating on a template. And that template is the consolidation of power, corruption, governance deficits, and so on. And they are actually not able to have concrete impacts, although it is actually also noted that women tend to raise some of these issues when they are in debates and so on, but those are far and in between and on the margins. So there is need to actually rethink how we are able to utilize women's agency in that context. I think I'll stop there for now.
Yes, a lot to think. Yeah, about the war, post-conflict, especially in the Sri Lankan case. We call Sri Lanka a post-war country because of the fact that the root causes of the conflict is not addressed. There are many. I mean, it's even the 13th Amendment to the Sri Lankan Constitution, it is not fully implemented. So there are legal side pending as well, the practical humanitarian side issues pending. The issue of the missing, again, the land issues, so rebuilding. So there are many issues, and that's why we call Sri Lanka also post-war, because we do need to address these issues for Sri Lanka to be a post-conflict country. And that's why we emphasize. You just don't want to say, okay, well, it's gone, let's move. I mean, you can't do that, because you have to rebuild. It's also human beings. I mean, we have to remember it's people. So for them to understand that they all are equal citizens of a country, and also come to terms. I mean, we know, like my son is missing in action. It's 25 years now for this year. But, I'm still waiting for him to come. But still, we need to move. We need to move as a country. And that's very important. So this is one thing and that's where the women come in, especially because of the fact that we could reach across every divide. Even during the war, we managed to bring women from Jaffna, the heart of the LTT. We managed to bring women from there and protest in front of the Fort, Colombo Fort railway station. We came together. We could come together. So this is where exactly much emphasis is not given the ability of women to reach out. The same thing in peace process, we used to tell. I mean, men will sit on the table after the negotiations, they'll go to their rooms. Now, of course, they'll go on their phones. Even at that time, when we had our process, they would have gone and done their work. But a woman will reach out to see, even a window shopping. I mean, we have so many things to get connected. I mean, these are very practical, true things. A good example, two men in one coach, they'll travel 100 miles and will get down without knowing each other. Two women, just one station, they'll know about the whole family. So I mean, why don't we use these our natural intuitions, our qualities for peace building? Because it is important. I mean, that's the cry. And the other thing is women in decision making. Yes, I do agree with you very much, Josephine, because I mean, you can have numbers of women there, but unless they are sensitive to the issues, that's important. And that's why we are working with local government women. At least we managed to get the quota. But we are also speaking about 1325. We are speaking about how, as a country, that we can come together. The importance, it's very important for decision makers, whether they are from the local level or at the top level, to understand that in any country, unless we go together, we are not going to see anything, because women come with positions. If they are political parties, they have their strong positions as much as men. So to use that ability of getting together, like even the women that we work with, we call the Smart 75 local level women, they come to each other. If one person is sick, they come. And even in midst of very strong election campaigns, in social media, they will write to each other, oh, you have a beautiful poster, right? I can't tell it in public, but you have. So they make the connection there. And then in Sister, they come together. So that's it. Yeah.
Thank you. And lastly, Angelica, do you want to turn to any parts of the question or any of the indicators Anne-Marie mentioned, if there's anything there you want to respond to?
Thank you. So first, in relation to what we are in terms of post-conflict, post-war, people in Colombia use the term of post-accord. And this has, of course, to do with the fact that the country has had over 20 peace processes. In fact, we are in one again, because the 2016 peace process that led to an agreement with FARC was not the final one. We're currently negotiating with the ELN, which was the hopefully last remaining guerrilla group. But I know we've made that promise several times, and we keep saying, this is the real peace process that will bring us peace, and still we keep struggling. So just to avoid this confusion about whether we are in conflict or in war or violence, whatever, we speak about post-accord. In fact, armed conflict has decreased significantly over the years, even before negotiations started. Homicides overall are down. Colombia is still a very violent country in comparison with other Latin American countries, and Latin America is still one of the most violent regions in the world. But I mean, just in historical terms, Colombia has improved significantly, both in overall homicides and specifically in combat-related homicides. So I should say that too. Of course, this will change depending on who you ask. I mean, just the fact that there is still so many forms of violence going on, many of them related to the illicit economies that have sustained our conflict, makes people wary about the possibility of really negotiating anything unless structural transformations take place and we stop thinking of peace as a negotiation between armed actors. But that's, I guess, a different discussion. About indicators, Anne-Marie, thank you so much. I thought your question was fascinating, and I would like to state a few things. First of all, of course, numbers matter. Just the mechanical issue of having people at the table provides you the kind of background you need in order to address the fundamental change. So yes, quotas work. Yes, looking for representation at different levels is important. And as you mentioned, the distinction between national and local is hugely important, because much may happen at the national level, sort of for the public attention, but at the local level, it's much harder to actually get women to be part of local authorities, of local decision-making bodies. And there is what I stated in my presentation, which is this hostile environment for women to be part. They are more likely to be accused of not fulfilling their traditional roles if they participate in politics. They are more likely to be singled out by armed actors and really be frightened into roles of passivity regarding regarding politics. So that is important. At the same time, of course, numbers alone are not enough, as Josephine very well mentioned. So we need to think also about what policy areas are more likely for women to have an impact on. And there, I think a huge issue is not even just addressing women and their role and their participation and their actual presence in any policy decision, but actually working with men and masculinities, I think is a huge challenge that we have, at least in Colombia, and I think in many societies worldwide, just, hoping and helping men out of the sometimes, I guess, loyalty to traditional roles, which make them feel concerned about losing some of the privileges with women. And I think that explains some of the backlash that I mentioned earlier. And then there's a big issue that is related to education, culture, and perception. In addition to what specific steps you take in order to provide women spaces at the table and in the decision-making process, you need to make sure people actually feel that is the right thing to do, and this has a positive impact on their lives. So just to maybe sum it up, I feel there are multiple layers and multiple indicators attached to each of these layers that you need to address in order to provide or just move towards greater gender equality and stronger participation by women in all of these processes.
Thank you so much. I know there was a question over here, so I want to be sure to turn to you, and then we'll take a few questions.
Okay, thank you. Oh, okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Manuela Rubiano Grot. I work with the Youth and Voice Office, and I worked before with UN Women back in Colombia in the Women, Peace and Security team. So thank you, everyone, for your presentations. I have two questions in terms of opportunities. I think, well, the first one is mainly related to poverty and livelihood opportunities, and what are the ways you think or innovative examples you have? Because I do think that, for example, women social leaders, human rights defenders are usually working on a volunteer basis, and it's unpaid work, and especially in contexts where armed conflict is ongoing. And livelihood opportunities have been affected further by the COVID pandemic. Pretending women to continue working and advocating for their rights and for peace and reconciliation without them having an income is a challenge. So I want to know more about your perspectives. I know the WPHF has interesting opportunities in terms of funding for grassroots and women's projects on livelihoods, but I want to know more about it. And then the second question is something, Paulo, you mentioned about young women and the opportunities that also come from young women's participation. I know there are lots of challenges, especially young women's participation in civic space right now in many countries in Latin America. But yeah, what do you think are the opportunities there in terms of young women's participation and reconciliation, if we can talk about post-conflict?
Thank you. We'll take, I think there were two more questions. Oh, okay, few questions.
Thank you. My name is Mohamed Sise from York University in Canada. I'm also a co-investigator in the hub. I am working on a project we call Land Rights, Gender Justice, and Legal Pluralism in Sierra Leone. I am working on this project with a colleague called Simeon Koroma. He's the head of Team Up for Justice that has been helping women to access justice in Sierra Leone. And as maybe many of you may know, Sierra Leone is also a well-known case in terms of peace building and post-war reconstruction and reconciliation. We share a lot of the issues that the panel have been talking about. I have a question. Maybe I will pose it as a general question and then add something specific to for Josephine to respond to. A lot of what is often said in terms of what international actors do to create space for women in these kinds of setting has to do with engagement with state actors and formal actors. But in reality, when you talk about the experiences of women, they often take place outside these spaces. For example, in Sierra Leone, we have what we call chieftaincy or traditional rulers. We have religious authorities. And if you're talking about the economy, we have the informal economy. So I guess my question is, what can be done to engage these actors and spaces outside the formal and state context, where in terms of the everyday women experience their lives in conflict and in post-conflict context? And for Josephine specifically, what can traditional rulers and traditional governance practices in Uganda do to help with the floating population? Thank you.
Thank you. And if it's all right with our panelists, I'm going to take the remaining 2 questions and then have you kind of address them in your closing remarks. Yep, we have one here and one here. I think those are our last 2. So do you want to go ahead and then we'll over here.
Hi, my name is Neelam Raina. I am a post-conflict reconstruction expert. I'm part of the Gender Justice Security Hub, and I'm based at Middlesex University in London. Thank you for asking my question about livelihoods. That was very useful. I have a specific question with regards to reprisals that was raised. And if we link reprisals to digital literacy, social media, and the presence of very fast moving information from conflict spaces, irrespective of whether they are post or during, when you see the reprisals of the patterns of behavior that are evident, for example, I work in Afghanistan. So the reprisals against the first gender apartheid, as you have used the terminology here, and the second, and that pattern of abuse and violence that is directed at women. My specific question is the principles of operation of all these actors within the international space and how you do, for example, audit trails. How do you deliver this money? How do you account for it? What are the reporting spaces? Are they, and is there any thinking there about rethinking those in light of the reprisals, in light of how Western governments, in inverted commas, are seen in these spaces and what this means to women? What does it mean to a woman who was part of a UN-funded program today in Afghanistan? And how do you raise the risk levels in these spaces for women who engage with these processes? Bearing in mind, reprisals seem to be cyclical. And when you see reprisals as cyclical and transmitting very quickly into other conflict spaces, how are we reinventing or how are we rethinking the way we deliver money on the ground, bearing in mind reprisals are not surprising, they are not new. In fact, they are a pattern of behavior in these spaces. Is there reconsideration of that?
Thank you. And our last question, go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much, Phoebe. My name is Helen Kezienwa, and I work with the Women's International Peace Center based in Kampala. My question for everyone. Women peace builders are experiencing shrinking civic space in all the contests and many other contests and the ones we have discussed this morning. I'm wondering if the nature of governance and the extent to which they are open to engaging with women impacts on their agency in post-conflict peace building. Because we have those situations now in Uganda where you can easily be labeled as opposition once you are promoting good governance or you're speaking for those issues that Professor Josephine has just discussed. But in many cases, because of the way things are being interpreted and the nature of governance, you're restricted in terms of what you can promote, the kind of advocacy you can do, and the issues you could actually engage with. My other question is for Pablo. Pablo, thank you for sharing, the fact that women peace builders, women peace mediators at the grassroots are making, more impact in terms of engaging in peace processes. We are seeing that with the work we are doing with women, grassroots women peace builders in Uganda. But my question is, do we have a framework for us to be able to collect data on the work that these women are doing? Because many times it's not recognized, it's not acknowledged. We usually hear it from you because you also receive these reports that we have, on WPF funding or the work that UN Women is doing. But globally, who has this information? Who is acknowledging it? And how can we then have a framework that enables us who work with these women to collect this information and see how we use it to showcase the fact that women are able to make impact, at that level, and use it to see how we can campaign or leverage the fact that they can also do better at national level. My last question, mental health in post-conflict peace building, mental health for this floating population we're talking about. Actually, they are huge. It's a huge population in Uganda, and we have interfaced with them. But in the case of Uganda, we are no more in post-conflict. We're actually in development phase, they say, So many times when you talk about mental health, they tell you, leave it to the Ministry of Health. That's not your work. How do we politicize mental health, for people who have experienced abduction, sexual violence in post-conflict setting, to be able to draw attention to the need that if we do not address mental health, we're not going to move ahead so much, in terms of peace building. Thank you so much.
Thank you for all those rich questions. I will give a quick summary for our panelists on the different questions, so feel free to respond to components of them. We had the question on poverty and livelihood. We had a question about young women. We had a question on kind of work outside of formal state spaces, the question on reprisals, and then these final questions on the shrinking civic space, mental health, and data collection. So maybe if you could tie any components into those questions, this will be our lightning round of closing remarks. So if you can keep it to 1 to 2 minutes. If anyone has to run out from our audience, I understand, but I hope we can hear from our panelists. Thank you so much. We'll start going this way. Pablo, why don't you start us off?
Okay. Anne-Marie, on indicators, if I could only pick one, it would be women's participation in the formal workforce. And if I could pick a sub-indicator from that, it would be women in public administration, in particular, in conflict and post-conflict countries. UNDP collects this data. I think the last number I saw was 23%, which is less than half of the global average. So it is a marked difference. And for all the reasons that you've taught me about the impact of, in many of these countries, women are like 30, 40 points lower than men in the participation in the workforce. On engaging young women, there is a potential case study for all of you from the LSC Hub in Lebanon. UN Women there, once women had such an important role in the protests, UN Women started facilitating a dialogue between the women in the political parties and the emerging young leaders of the social movements and the street protests and everything. And I think that's a very interesting example that hasn't been documented. So maybe you can offer your services. On women at the women's community mediation, women at the grassroots, there is no framework, there is no data, there is no global data. It is not one of the WPS indicators. I think DPO, for all of their work that they're doing, are collecting, they have WPS indicators, and they may have one on this because they're producing lots of good examples, but what you get are specific examples of work that happened, not a number, nothing that you can measure. And I might, on risk and reprisals, I would recommend you look at the situation in Myanmar, the UN Women Country Office and its response to the coup and what they had to do to change the profile of how they worked with the women's organizations inside Myanmar and those outside, political versus humanitarian, and managing to get exceptions for unregistered organizations to receive cash. There's much more to say about that, but.
Yeah. In November, we held a regional convention in Gulu. And one of the things that I said, which was captured on television, was that the security people should stop arresting these children. They don't belong to the street. These are children that have been born, and you better find out why they are behaving the way they do. And I received a phone call which said, "Aren't you afraid?" Which meant that there's so little space to actually point out even things that are obvious. And what you say about repoliticizing these issues, the peace agenda is very critical. And the question is, what will be the pathways for that repoliticization without compromising individual security of the actors, of women actors in the peace agenda. I think that's very important. I think Sisi talked about the acting in a wide kind of realm, not directly only talking about state actors or state institutions. And one of the things also that we have done in these regional interventions, not interventions, conventions that we've had, is to include cultural leaders. Because also cultural leaders or cultural institutions have been victims of the war. The things that you call cultural institutions are no longer as intact as they should be. And therefore, there is also this whole conflict within the community about what the cultural leaders or cultural institutions are able to do. And one of the things that we emphasize is to also kind of bring the conversations around what are the inclusivity spaces that have been in this culture, as we call it, for example, the Acholi culture. One of them is we ask them, this thing used to be that girls, if they produce a child and the child has no known father, that child directly belongs. And the answer is, we are powerless because the community has disintegrated. So meaning that there is a need to actually, kind of rebuild the social cohesion, even for you to engage the cultural institutions, because already there's that rift within the community. There's a rift and the fact that then women or men are not able to engage the way that the cultural norms are supposed to be. So that is something that is really important in terms of what are the opportunities for entry, for example, the UN agencies, in terms of concretely looking at the root causes and being able to re-energize the policy spaces, and also as well in the community, in terms of the community agency and how community is able to re-energize itself. Because I think we need to actually look at that point in terms of not just the state institutions, but the community itself, and being able to reinvent itself in terms of rebuilding social cohesion. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll start with the shrinking spaces. Yes, I mean, that is a challenge, I think, across everywhere. But you can be also creative. In Sri Lanka, when we had the Easter Sunday bomb, like for one whole month, we didn't have to have any COVID restrictions. Nobody came out. People were so scared. And we're thinking it really, really broke down all whatever we have built together, because not only men, but women also didn't want to talk to each other. So it was a really, really a big divide. And what we did, a very small thing, that bringing women of diverse religions and ethnicities together to build women peer committees. So they came together, 10 of them, in very close to the epicenter, or the people who were there, who was responsible for the bombing. And these women came together to do something to, every month. When they went to a Christian church to clean the church because they really want to do something, the police came, the neighbors got the police to come, the women with, some women were there with the Christian women, with the Hindu women, but also with the, head scarves and all. Finally, the police called me and asked, are you going to take the responsibility if there is a bomb here? I said, look, yes, I will take the responsibility that these women will not blast a bomb within the church. So that's how they could come together. And even during COVID, they were together disseminating information. So we now have 15 peer committees in 15 districts of the country, women of diverse districts coming together, because that's why I was telling, like, women are the connectors. So you really have to work with the women where they are best at and build it up on the negotiation table, just like Monica McWilliams did in the Irish process. You use the weekend to get together, and then you come back and together because you have spoken. And from that, I want to also speak very little about the poverty and livelihood, and that's how I am connected to the LAC Hub, because we are working with 4 countries, really with those peer committees for women livelihood, and especially Sri Lanka is going through an economic hardship. So yes, no peace without full stomach. So that's important. And that is why we are working on livelihoods, where the crafts, especially crafts. I would like to extend an invitation for you tomorrow from 1 to 3 o'clock in our Sri Lankan mission, 820 2nd Avenue. We will be having an exhibition and a session on livelihood, like, post-conflict livelihood. Thank you very much. Yes.
Okay, so I keep reminding myself that I'm a political scientist by training and by heart. So for me, this understanding this issue of inclusion of women is always a question of power, and I think that's clear to most of us. Therefore, I'm not surprised that gender is used for electoral strategizing. Backlash for me is a function of a dispute over power, as well as the ongoing institutional discussion. So what I would just like to add to what everybody has said right now is that we need to think more about best practice and inclusion, not about the if, but about the how. And I think that's a discussion that we've really not have had that profoundly. And I think that's some of the emerging lessons also of the research that we've been producing in the hub. And I'd just like to end there. Thank you.
Thank you so much to our panelists, to our very active audience, to the Gender Justice and Security Hub. And I encourage us all to keep these conversations going while everyone's focused on these kind of issues right now during CSW. It's always CSW in our minds at the Women, Peace and Security Program at IPI. So please do stay in touch with us and join me in thanking our panelists.